So we've just heard a really compelling talk about justice-involved youth. And I'm going to talk to you this morning about a specific justice-involved youth that sets up the stage for what I want to say to you this morning about the importance of mentors in the lives of traumatized youth. What I want to start with is reminding us all that on June 6, 2015, Khalif Browder committed suicide following a torturous period of incarceration in New York's now infamous Rikers Island. Now, like many youth in our nation, Khalif crumbled under the tremendous weight of undertreated and possibly underdetected trauma. Now, as a trauma psychologist, I've had the privilege of hearing countless trauma stories, often from some of our nation's most honorable service members. But I have to tell you that even in all those stories, all of the stories about Vietnam, about Operation Iraqi Freedom, I have not heard a story as compelling and as troubling to me as Khalif's. And I'm haunted by his story and by his last words, "Ma, I can't take it anymore." Now, I believe that we should all be haunted by Khalif's story. We should all be haunted by his words because they are emblematic of the ways that our children cry out in the midst of trauma and systems fail to adequately respond. And this failure to respond is something that I'm sure future generations will condemn us for. Right now, as we sit in this ballroom in our nation's capital, there is a child or youth who is experiencing a potentially traumatizing event, like cyberbullying, physical abuse, neglect, sexual assault, community violence, death at the hands of law enforcement officers. And in fact, according to recent estimates compiled by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, nearly 9 out of 1,000 children in the US on average are victims of child abuse and neglect. 1 in 4 high school students have been in at least one physical fight. And researchers estimate that each year, the number of youth requiring hospital treatment for physical assault-related injuries would likely fill every seat in 9 football stadiums. Now, we can rattle off compelling statistics affirming that traumatic events and exposures enact enduring impacts on the physical and emotional well-being of children. We know that trauma is even more impactful when it is inflicted during periods when brain development is unfolding. We even know that trauma affects racial and ethnic minority children differently. We're living in a time when we've become accustomed to talking about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We know that ACEs accumulate disproportionately in ways that can impact the person's capacity to regulate emotional competence, that it can alter individual blueprint and impair one's immune system and response. We know that trauma can increase your risk for substance use and misuse and addiction and problems with mental health. And yet, we are still not responding in ways that are effective. We know that we are now more trauma-informed. Congratulations. But the question is, have we been holding space for the time-lagged impacts, the signs, the wounds that trauma produces? Have we been thinking about what happens after the wound infliction? When we think about wound, we're usually talking about an injury to living tissue caused by a cut, blow, or other impact, typically one in which the skin is broken. But unlike cut or broken skin, trauma creates spiritual and psychological tears in individuals' sense of safety, creates invisible and visible wounds to the minds, bodies, and spirits of our nation's most sacred resource, our children. And it's not just that these exposures are occurring in a country with a formidable military defense strategy, but that we have failed to mount an equally urgent and strategic response to childhood trauma, which I argue is an undeniable threat to our national security. There has been a structural lapse in our nation's call and response, right? So the call from our children manifests as higher rates of suicide at completion among boys and men. The upticks in suicides that we're now seeing in young Black boys as young as 8 years old. Black boys like Gabriel, Rylan, and Nigel, and beautiful Black girls like Mackenzie. We have socialized our children to be strong, stoic, and silent. And we wonder why they don't tell us the troubles they've seen. We ask them, what's wrong with you? Get it together, instead of what's happened to you. Or more importantly, who do you want to become? We treat young black, brown boys and girls as adults, or worse, as superheroes. We expect them to leap over systematic dehumanization, trauma, and structural disadvantage in a single bout. We expect our children to wear what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the wrestler's mask. But we, the guardians at the gate, the mentors who have been charged with their care, watch them sometimes, unbeknownst to us, being ground into dust, and we expect them to resurrect themselves into T'Challa. When the harsh truth is that we live in a society that places a premium on emotion suppression and on our youth being seen and not heard. We want them to keep their mouths closed and their hearts open. Our children are opening up all the time. They are telling us when they're in pain, but we need to believe them the first time. We, the mentors, the guardians at the gate, have tremendous work to do on behalf of the millions of traumatized children who come through and to us. We have to widen and mind and really bridge the deepening empathy gap. We have got to speak to the wounds. Mentors have this proximity, this power of proximity to speak to the wounds of youth. Speaking to the wounds means reminding ourselves that many traumatized children and youth devise all kinds of strategies for performing wholeness, and too often suffer in silence because of shame, blame, and fear. Speaking to the wounds means actively fighting to dismantle trauma and re-traumatizing systems. Speaking to the wounds requires us to respond to trauma not with loathing and punishment, harsh punishment, but with questions like, where is the true spirit injury here? What is this behavior telling me about what this child has been through or what they have experienced? Speaking to the wound means listening with a third ear, treating the behavior as a symptom and not the condition, and responding to these with radical empathy. It requires us to hold space, holding space where healing and wound care for children can occur who are being buried alive in prisons, in neighborhoods, and schools. So mentors, what is our role? We have to be path clearers. We have to create not safe spaces, but brave spaces where youth impacted by trauma can have their voices amplified and reminded that although they may be wounded, they may someday become warriors. We failed Khalif, who, like many of our traumatized youth, just wanted to be heard, wanted to get back to baseline, to reassemble the parts of himself that got scattered and consumed in the trauma of unjust incarceration. He needed someone to say, he needed someone to see him, he needed someone to say, we see you, we know where you're from and where you're from. We failed him because we were so rigidly focused on his bounce back, his resilience, that we failed to comprehend that resilience narrative sometimes teaches our children to question the legitimacy and the depths of their wounds. Khalif died for the sins of the justice system, when what he probably needed most was for someone to say, hold on. For someone to say, hold on. Just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer. Hold on, just a little while longer. Everything will be all right. And it will be. It will be all right because healing-centered mentors are in this room. It will be all right because healing-centered mentors will listen to these heart songs and encourage our children to cry, to feel, and to show up with their wounds unbandaged and exposed. I wished Khalif would have survived his trauma. I wish he'd known that we did see him. I wished that he had heard the words from Elizabeth Lesser. who teaches us that while trauma may leave us feeling broken, the truth is that these experiences may merely just be breaking us open. Every day I wake up with Khalif on my mind. I am on a mission. And I have a fire in my belly to be present and consistent in the lives of children and youth that I mentor and serve. I am telling them to hold on. I wake up and encourage them that because they have been to the depths of hell, they can rise to the heights of heaven. I know that mentors like you are providing the wound care for the many Khalifs among us who are in need. And what I want to say to you today is to be encouraged by the opportunities for mentorship. May we, as Toni Morrison encourages us always, light up when our children enter the room. And when they enter the room, carrying the weight of trauma on their shoulders, may we, by the grace of our ancestors and God, offer them respite. And may we speak earnestly, fearlessly, and lovingly into their wounds. Thank you.